Last week, we were all into the nature's candy, cherry. Sweet, small, and full of nutrition. But there are some days when you feel like indulging yourself in not so healthy sweets. And it's okay. Once in a while, you deserve a treat. Sugar became popular in around 16th and 17th century. So, do you ever wonder what did people use before that? And did they even enjoy such sweet treats? Well, of course. How could they not? There is something so tantalizing about this natural compound which makes us insatiable. Welcome. You're listening to TALRadio, powered by Touch a Life Foundation, and this is Foodology. I'm radio host Devansh, and on this show, I talk about the enormous world of a little word called food. In the old days, when human beings were living in forests, sweetness was an indication of a particular thing that was safe to eat. We knew fruits were safe because they were sweet. There is probably no food in nature that is both sweet and toxic. So the brain developed a reward pathway that made eating sweet foods pleasurable, and it forced people to eat such things more and more. This enjoyment that you feel from eating something sweet is carried out by the same morphine-like biochemical systems in the brain that are thought to be the basis for all highly rewarding and happy activities. Throughout history, our survival depended on our ability to take in energy from our diets. One major source of such energy is carbohydrates, which includes sugars. In order to maximize our energy intake, our preference for food generally increases as the sweetness increases in a particular food item. And saying so, desserts were no stranger to early humans. They began the concept of snacking on fruits, and they slowly developed this into a full course in itself. In fact, the word dessert is derived from the French word desservir, which translates to clear the table. This origin is somewhat hazy, but considering the first use of desserts was to wash down the aftertaste of a large meal. Desserts in history, more importantly in the Middle Ages, revolved more around fruity sweets, like jellies and wafers mixed with exotic fruits, nuts, cream, and indeed, the custard is known to be one of the first desserts ever eaten in the Middle Ages. Then slowly, desserts started coming in all shapes, sizes, and flavors. Up until the 17th century, desserts were meshed together with savory dishes that were used as nothing more than palate cleansers. However, it was in the 17th century when we saw the advent of dessert cookbooks. This spread in popularity of desserts. And this popularity is also owed to the vast sugar plantations in the New World that allowed sugar costs to go down. Now, with reduced sugar prices, sugar could be used abundantly for sweet foods, instead of being regulated as a rare ingredient. For those of us who share an affinity towards desserts, I would say that cakes would be our most preferred one. Not only because they are delicious, but also because of their association with celebrations and happy times. And since the dessert course is so vast in itself, it would be rather impossible to get into everything. So, for today, we'll stick to the basics and our favorites. Cakes. The word cake is of Viking origin, derived from the Norse word kaka. The first cakes that were made were actually quite different from the ones we eat today. Interestingly, the ancient Egyptians were the first culture to exhibit such baking skills. And during the ancient times, the cakes were more bread-like in appearance, and they were sweetened with honey. In fact, there was no distinction between bread and cake for quite a while. Although fancy sweet breads were made with a variety of grains and other added ingredients like dry fruits, seeds, wines, and they were specifically served as sweet treats. But there was no classification for breads and cakes. The Greeks also had an early form of cheesecake, while the Romans developed their own versions of fruit cakes with raisins, nuts, and other fruits. By the mid-1800s, the introduction of bicarbonate of soda and baking powder made it easier to bake an airy cake quickly and consistently. Of course, the supply and demand played a very important role in the development of cakes. The availability of flour, sugar, eggs, spices, and fat were an important factor contributing to the popularity and development of different types of cakes. Then in the 19th century, cake as we know it became more popular. However, the treat was considered a luxury as sweet ingredients like sugar and chocolate were still expensive. During this time, cakes were baked with extra refined white flour and baking powder instead of yeast. Buttercream frostings also began to be replaced by traditionally boiled icings. Also, thanks to the advancements in technological equipments like ovens and other electrical gadgets, which made a baker's life much easier. Now, no longer did the bakers had to continuously watch for their cakes or spend hours beating eggs or powdering the sugar. Even more, the Industrial Revolution made ingredients more readily available, which made them cheaper, so more people could bake them and even buy them at a store. And that's how the cake evolved over centuries. Well, the story of the development of cakes was a complete roller coaster. But there is one thing that remained constant throughout ages, which is the classic round shape. Well, have you ever wondered why are cakes round? Of course, today we find them in an array of shapes and sizes. But we all know that cake in its simplest form is round. Why so? And why in history this round cake was popularized throughout the world? Why not square or why not triangle? Although cakes can be baked in virtually any shape imaginable. But there are several theories why most cakes are traditionally round in shape. Well, generally the round cakes we enjoy today were made by hand, and they were molded into round balls. And while baking, the bread would naturally get relaxed into a rounded shape. Hence, this round shape of the cake became popular. Although, there is another theory, which is that the gods preferred round cakes. In ancient times, some civilization baked cakes as a kind gesture for their gods and spirits. A round cake was meant to symbolize the cyclic nature of life, as well as the sun and the moon. Incidentally, this theory could explain why we serve cakes at special occasions like birthdays to symbolize the cycle of life. It is very hard to find someone who does not love cake. There is basically a cake for every taste bud, every age group, and every preference. That's how much our species love cake. There are many different types of cakes, and a lot of ways to divide them into various categories. But there are two basic main types of cakes: butter cakes or shortened cakes and foam cakes. And then within each category there are several types of cakes, and there are cakes which do not fall in either of the categories. The primary difference between butter and foam cakes is the fat content. Butter cakes have either butter, oil, or shortening in them, whereas foam cakes have little to no fat and typically involve whipped eggs, which make them lighter and airier. Let's talk about some of the classic cakes, which you must have heard of. And if not, keep listening because they're all worth it. Why not start with the simplest of them all, a pound cake? It is a super rich cake, which is almost impossible to go wrong with. An easy way to identify a pound cake is by its ingredients: a pound of butter, a pound of sugar, a pound of eggs, and a pound of flour. They're often baked in a loaf or a bun pan, and there are many different types of pound cakes. Pound cake origins can go back to 18th century Europe, where the first recipe was made by using a pound of each of the ingredients. This was actually a very clever way to make sure that the recipe could be easily shared in time and many people would be simply able to make it. Due to the traditional measurements of the ingredients used in the cake, the size of this cake is enough to serve multiple of families on the go. But the modern day people and families prefer a lighter and smaller cakes. Therefore, the original recipe over time has been modified. Today, people use lesser quantities, but they still maintain the whole 1:1 ratio of the ingredients. A chiffon cake. A chiffon cake is the most recent invention in the world of cakes. It is a hybrid oil and sponge cake. It can be said that it's the best of both worlds. It has the rich and moist crumb of the oil cakes and the airiness of sponge cakes. The result is a cake that's moist, light, and fluffy. Unlike other sponges, chiffon cake often calls for a leavening agent in addition to whipped egg whites. Both of these contribute to the cake's lightness. And wait, the delicate nature of this kind of sponge cake makes it ideal for being glazed or iced. Chiffon cake was invented by an insurance agent, Harry Baker, in Los Angeles. In 1927, he came up with an unusual cake that was light and fluffy, more tender than an angel food cake, which I will get into later on in today's episode. This chiffon cake became the toast of Hollywood. Harry Baker sold his cakes to stars for their parties, and he made cakes for the elite restaurants. Initially, he kept his recipe a well-kept secret, but he finally decided to sell it in 1947 for the whole world to enjoy. A cheesecake. Is this actually a cake or a flan or a pie? It depends on who you ask. Some people say that the inclusion of eggs for leavening makes it a rich dessert type of cake. Cheesecake is just one of the desserts that falls into category of having cake in its name, but is not technically a cake. Any which ways, we know that it's delicious. There are baked and unbaked versions, and they come in a variety of regional styles, but they all contain some type of fresh cheese. The ancient Greeks in the 5th century BC on the islands of Samos created the earliest known cheesecake. This early cheesecake was made with fresh cheese along with flour and honey. This creation was then baked into an earthenware griddle before being enjoyed by the masses. Back then, cheesecake was considered a great source of energy, and there is evidence showing that athletes during the first Olympic Games in 776 BC used a cheesecake as an energy source. Cheesecakes also became a popular wedding dessert. Gradually, this evolved over the centuries and became what we know it as today. Red velvet cake. This infamous cake gained popularity in the 20th century, but its roots are quite historic. Like with many other recipes, the red velvet cake's true origins aren't completely known. This classic was popular especially in the south of US. Made with either butter or oil, red velvet cake's color traditionally comes from the reaction of buttermilk and cocoa powder Initially, this cake wasn't created for the infamous color, but for its soft, pillowy texture. Velvet cakes have been made since the 1800s. Recipes call for the use of cocoa to soften the flour and make finer textured cakes. This smooth texture gave these cakes a name, velvet cakes. The Adams Extract Company claims that the original red velvet cake was made by them in 1920s. And at the same time, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City also claims that it is the birthplace of the red velvet cake. Some argue that this cake was invented in the South. While there is no clear answer, we do know that something between the 1920s and 1950s happened which made the red velvet cake popular in the US. The Genoa sponge cake. Genoa is a simple sponge cake made with eggs, sugar, flour, and sometimes melted butter and vanilla extract. It is a light and fluffy cake which is frequently used in layered cakes. It can be flavored with chocolate, jams, cream, buttercream, fruit custard, and so much more. The Genoa cake originated in the port city of Genoa, in Italy, in the early 19th century. A Genoa sponge is basically a building block of many French patisserie and is used for making several different types of cakes. Angel food cake. The lightest of the light. Angel food cake is made with only whipped egg whites for leavening and has no fat at all. Traditionally, this cake is baked in a special angel food cake pan, which should be cooled upside down to help maintain the airy texture. The loads of sugar in an angel food cake gives it a chewy and sponge-like texture. Angel food cake has a texture and appearance that is entirely its own. It is well known that angel food cake originated in the US in the mid-1800s. What is not certain is where and who created this light cake. Some historians think that the first angel food cake was probably baked by African American enslaved people, because making this cake required a strong beating arm and lots of labor to whip the air into the egg whites. There are other theories as well. Whichever story may be true, angel food cake is certainly worthy of its name. The devil food cake. Of course, if there's an angel food cake, there's obviously a devil's food cake. It is dark, dense, and rich, and people make it even more sinful by adding chocolate. It is completely opposite to its counterpart, the angel food cake. The devil food cake is similar to a red velvet cake, except the red velvet uses a white frosting, while devil's food cake has a chocolate frosting. This cake originated in southern US, and the first printed recipe appeared in Sarah Tyson's book, Mrs. Roro's New Cookbook. The original recipe used melted chocolate and baking powder, unlike the modern version, which uses cocoa powder and baking soda. No matter the name, this cake is so indulgent in itself that it would leave you wanting more. Cakes and their mouth-watering taste can melt any heart. And even a small mention of the name of the dessert brings water in our mouths. From black forest to red velvet, and from vanilla to strawberry, cakes come in hundreds of flavors, and there are so many options when it comes to choosing a flavor for your cake. You can choose any different flavor and for any occasion. And I trust you that you will never be bored of the varieties. I have only mentioned a few, but maybe we can talk about some others in another episode. It's time for me to take leave. Thank you so much for sticking around with me on this episode of Foodology. I had an incredible time talking to you. This is radio host Devansh, signing off. Hope you have a beautiful and a magical day ahead.